There is a powerful idea at the heart of ego is the enemy, and it is this: the obstacle that causes the most damage in our lives is often not outside us, but within us. Ryan Holiday uses the word ego to describe that unhealthy part of the self that always wants to be larger, more admired, more important, more certain, and more protected than reality justifies. Ego wants credit before effort, recognition before mastery, control without humility, and sympathy without accountability. It is not only loud arrogance. It can also appear as defensiveness, insecurity, self-obsession, comparison, vanity, and the inability to see ourselves clearly. This is what makes the book so compelling. It does not only warn against obvious pride. It shows how subtle ego can be and how easily it can disguise itself as confidence, ambition, or self-belief. Holiday's central message is that ego can sabotage us at every stage of life. Before success, it can make us obsessed with appearing talented instead of becoming capable. During success, it can make us careless, self-satisfied, and blind. During failure, it can turn pain into humiliation and prevent recovery. In that sense, ego is not a small flaw to manage. It is a recurring force that distorts judgment, weakens character, and interferes with growth. This book asks us to confront a difficult possibility. What if many of our recurring problems are not caused only by circumstances, but by the way our ego reacts to circumstances? What if the need to be seen, praised, proven right, or protected has been costing us more than we realize? And what if the path to a better life is not just more ambition, but more humility, more discipline, and more accuracy about who we are? That is the conversation this book opens. It is not interested in boosting the ego. It is interested in exposing it, reducing its influence, and clearing space for steadier, wiser, and more meaningful work. One reason ego is the enemy resonates with so many readers is that Holiday defines ego in a broad and practical way. He is not speaking in technical psychological language. He is speaking about the everyday distortions that happen when our sense of self becomes too inflated or too fragile. Ego says, "I already know enough." Ego says, "I deserve recognition now." Ego says, "Criticism is an insult." Ego says, "Success proves I am exceptional." Ego says, "Failure means I am ruined." Notice how ego can be present in both superiority and insecurity. That is one of the book's most useful insights. A person can appear boastful because of ego, but they can also be constantly wounded, anxious, and self-protective because of ego. In both cases, the self is at the center. The person is too attached to image, too reactive to perception, and too dependent on external validation. Holiday shows that ego is dangerous because it breaks our relationship with reality. It makes us less teachable, less observant, less patient, less willing to serve the work. It replaces truth with performance. Once that happens, we stop asking, "What does this situation require?" And we start asking, "What does this situation mean about me?" That shift changes everything. It makes learning harder, relationships more brittle, and setbacks more dramatic than they need to be. The point of the book is not to destroy all self-confidence. It is to distinguish between grounded confidence and ego-driven self-importance. Grounded confidence helps you act. Ego makes you act out. Grounded confidence is built on work, character, and evidence. Ego is hungry for status, reassurance, and control. Holiday wants the reader to understand that the problem is not having self-respect. The problem is allowing our need to feel important to become stronger than our commitment to reality. Once that happens, we stop growing. We start protecting an image instead of building a life. The first major phase Holiday explores is aspiration, the period when we are striving towards something. This is the season of ambition, learning, possibility, and hunger. At first glance, it might seem like ego would be useful here. After all, don't we need belief in ourselves to begin? Holiday's answer is that ambition matters, but ego is different from ambition. Ambition wants to build. Ego wants to be seen building. Ambition wants improvement. Ego wants recognition. Ambition can stay patient. Ego wants proof right now. This distinction is one of the book's most practical contributions. Many people sabotage themselves early because they become attached to the identity of being exceptional before they have done the work required to become excellent. They announce too soon. They imagine too much. They talk more than they practice. They perform seriousness instead of living it. Holiday is especially critical of this pattern because it creates the illusion of progress without the substance of progress. A person begins to enjoy the feeling of being associated with greatness before they have earned any of its demands. In that way, ego acts almost like a substitute drug. It gives temporary emotional rewards while quietly weakening discipline. The book therefore praises the beginner's mindset. Stay a student. Stay humble. Stay willing to be corrected. Stay close to the craft rather than the image of the craft. If you want to become a writer, write more than you announce. If you want to become a leader, learn more than you impress. If you want to become excellent at anything, spend less time curating identity and more time submitting to reality. This part of the book is deeply relevant in a world shaped by constant self-presentation. It is easier than ever to look ambitious, to project certainty, and to attach yourself publicly to goals that are still private fantasies. Holiday warns that this habit drains the quiet energy needed for actual mastery. He wants aspiration to become serious, disciplined, and rooted in work rather than vanity. The person who protects their image too early often becomes too fragile to improve. The person who remains teachable for longer, who is willing to be unknown, awkward, unfinished, and underestimated, often builds something much stronger in the end. Flowing from that first section is one of the book's recurring virtues, humility. Holiday treats humility not as weakness, but as an operational advantage. A humble person sees more clearly because they are less committed to protecting a flattering illusion. They can listen. They can observe. They can admit ignorance. They can revise their thinking. They can accept that the work is bigger than their current self. This is why humility is so important in the early stages of any pursuit. The apprentice who does not need to look brilliant can learn faster than the beginner who is terrified of seeming ordinary. The artist who cares more about the craft than the image can survive the awkward early years. The entrepreneur who stays open to reality can adapt. The leader who remains teachable keeps growing instead of hardening into performance. Holiday's argument here is subtle but powerful. Ego is not only morally unattractive, it is strategically inefficient. It slows learning because it resists correction. It distorts observation because it sees what flatters the self. And it makes patience harder because ego wants visible advancement, not slow development. One reason this matters so much is that the beginning of any worthwhile path usually feels repetitive, unglamorous, and uncertain. There are few external rewards. There is often embarrassment. There are long stretches of practice that do not look impressive from the outside. Ego hates that environment. It wants shortcuts to significance. Humility can endure it. In this way, humility becomes a form of endurance. It allows a person to stay in the room long enough to become good. Holiday's larger point is that many people could go much farther if they were willing to remain students longer. That means doing the work without needing constant recognition. It means seeking truth instead of self-protection. It means becoming more committed to reality than to reputation. In the long run, that posture does not shrink a person. It strengthens them. If ego is a problem during aspiration, Holiday argues it can become even more dangerous during success. Success creates a seductive environment. Praise increases. Opportunities multiply. People begin to treat you differently. You start to see proof that your effort matters. All of this can be healthy if handled well. But success also carries a hidden threat. It can convince a person that they have become bigger than the discipline that produced the success in the first place. Once that happens, ego begins to take over. the person starts believing the story of their importance. They mistake momentum for invulnerability. They become less curious, less careful, and less open to criticism. They may still look successful from the outside, but internally they are changing in dangerous ways. Holiday repeatedly points to the difference between serving the work and serving the ego. In the early stages, a person may be driven by craft, mission, or disciplined ambition. But once recognition arrives, ego tempts them to shift their attention toward image management. They become performers of success. They care more about maintaining a reputation than maintaining the habits that earn the reputation. This is a crucial observation because it explains why so many promising people become disappointing later. It is not always because they lose talent. It is often because they lose sobriety. They become insulated. They stop listening. They start believing they are exceptions to the rules that still govern everyone else. Holiday's warning is simple. Success is not proof that ego is under control. In many cases, success is the very thing that reveals how weak self-control really is. The antidote is continued discipline, continued service, and a refusal to become intoxicated by attention. Keep showing up. Keep doing the work. Keep letting reality correct you. The moment praise becomes more important than purpose, the decline may already be underway. This part of the book is not anti-success. It is anti-delusion. Holiday wants success to be sustainable, and sustainability requires humility after achievement just as much as before it. An important distinction in ego is the enemy is the difference between confidence and ego. These are often confused, but they are not the same. Confidence is grounded. Ego is inflated. Confidence makes action easier. Ego makes reality harder to accept. Confidence is compatible with learning because it does not require perfection. Ego is threatened by learning because learning begins with admitting that something is missing. Holiday encourages the reader to build a steadier kind of confidence, one based on work, evidence, and character rather than image. This matters because many people think the answer to insecurity is to think more highly of themselves. But inflated self-regard is unstable. It depends on constant protection. The more exaggerated your self-image, the more painful every contradiction becomes. Confidence built on reality is different. It does not require you to be the best in every room. It does not collapse when someone knows more than you do. It does not panic when criticism appears. It simply allows you to keep functioning, learning, and contributing without becoming consumed by how you are being perceived. This is one of Holiday's most mature insights. The goal is not to feel superior. The goal is to remain useful. A truly confident person can often be quieter because they do not need to prove themselves constantly. They can let the work speak. They can accept temporary invisibility. They can focus on substance instead of theater. Ego, by contrast, is always looking sideways. It compares, competes, exaggerates, and reacts. It cannot rest because it is built on insecurity disguised as power. By separating these two states, Holiday gives the reader a more intelligent way to think about self-belief. You do not need an inflated ego to do meaningful work. In fact, meaningful work often becomes easier once you are less occupied with yourself. Another major lesson of the book is that ego isolates people from reality by making everything too personal. When self-importance grows, disagreement feels like disrespect. Feedback feels like an attack. Limits feel insulting. Other people begin to exist mainly as mirrors, obstacles, or audiences. This has serious consequences. It weakens leadership because a leader who cannot separate the mission from the self becomes reactive and vain. It weakens collaboration because collaboration requires listening, compromise, and an interest in truth that is bigger than the need to be right. It weakens relationships because ego turns ordinary conflict into threats against identity. And it weakens judgment because once self-image becomes sacred, evidence will be filtered to protect it. Holiday's warning is not only about public figures or famous failures. It applies to ordinary life. You can see it in workplaces where talented people become impossible to coach. You can see it in creative life where artists fall in love with their own image and stop developing. You can see it in families and friendships where apology becomes impossible because being wrong feels intolerable. The book keeps returning to the same point. The more central the self becomes, the harder it is to see clearly. Ego narrows attention inward. Service expands attention outward. This is why Holiday often elevates duty, craft, and contribution over self-display. A person anchored in service can handle more reality because the purpose is larger than the ego. A person anchored in self-importance is always one wound away from distortion. This section of the book quietly asks a difficult question. Are you trying to do good work, or are you trying to defend an image of yourself as someone who does good work? Those are not the same thing, and confusing them can destroy both effectiveness and peace. The final major phase in the book is failure, and this is where Holiday's argument becomes especially human. Failure is part of every serious life. Ambitions collapse. Reputations crack. Plans fall apart. We are criticized, ignored, embarrassed, defeated, or forced to begin again. The question is not whether these moments will happen. The question is what ego will do to them once they arrive. Holiday argues that ego makes failure heavier than it needs to be. It adds humiliation to pain. It adds vanity to disappointment. It adds narrative drama to what might otherwise become a difficult but useful lesson. Ego says, "This cannot be happening to me." Ego says, "I was supposed to be beyond this." Ego says, "If I failed, then I am diminished." Once those thoughts take hold, recovery becomes harder. Instead of learning, the person defends. Instead of adapting, they deny. Instead of accepting responsibility, they search for excuses that preserve the self-image. Holiday does not suggest that failure should feel pleasant. He does not flatten the emotional reality of loss. What he changes is the meaning of it. Failure becomes less catastrophic when it is not treated as an assault on identity. A person with less ego can say, "This hurts, but I can still learn. I was wrong, but I am not finished. I lost something, but I can still become wiser through the loss." That posture makes resilience possible. It allows pain to remain pain without becoming personal annihilation. This is one of the book's most compassionate teachings. When ego is reduced, suffering does not disappear, but it becomes more workable. It can be carried with more dignity. It can be studied. It can become material for growth rather than proof of worthlessness. Holiday invites the listener to meet setbacks with sobriety rather than self-dramatization. That shift is not small. It may be the difference between a person who is broken by failure and a person who is refined by it. There is a liberating idea underneath Holiday's treatment of failure. If your identity is not built on constant self-inflation, then you are freer to recover. You can apologize. You can correct course. You can admit weakness. You can accept that your plans were flawed. You can go back to being a student. Ego resists all of that because ego experiences concession as humiliation. But real recovery often begins with some form of surrender to reality. Not surrender in the sense of giving up, but surrender in the sense of stopping the fight against what is true. This happened. I contributed to it. I have something to learn. I must adjust. That sequence requires humility, and humility is one of the great hidden powers of the book. It is what allows movement. A rigid ego is stuck because it must always protect itself. A humble person can move because they do not need to appear flawless. They can start again. This also changes the emotional texture of ambition. If you know that setbacks do not destroy your identity, you can take clearer risks. If you know criticism does not erase your worth, you can hear useful feedback. If you know that not knowing is not shameful, you can keep learning. The absence of ego does not make a person passive. It often makes them bolder in the healthiest sense, because they are no longer spending so much energy defending a fragile image. Holiday's broader lesson is that resilience is not just toughness. It is flexibility with self-respect. It is the ability to face facts without collapsing. It is the ability to absorb blows without turning every blow into a story of personal injustice. In that way, the fight against ego is not only a moral discipline. It is also a practical path to endurance. Although ego is the enemy is accessible to a wide audience, it is deeply shaped by Stoic thought. You can feel that influence in its repeated emphasis on self-command, discipline, perspective, and service. The Stoic undercurrent matters because it places the problem of ego inside a larger vision of character. The goal is not merely to become less arrogant. The goal is to live with more clarity, to do the work in front of you, to focus on what you can control, to see praise and blame with some distance, to serve something larger than your own vanity. This is part of what gives the book its steady seriousness. It is not merely telling us to be modest, because modesty is attractive. It is telling us that ego clouds judgment, makes action less effective, and interferes with a life of substance. Stoicism, in this context, means remembering that events are not always under our control, but our conduct remains our responsibility. It means not building identity on applause. It means not confusing emotional intensity with truth. It means caring more about virtue, effort, and usefulness than about personal image. Holiday's great skill is to present these ideas in a modern voice. He connects ancient discipline to contemporary problems like self-branding, status obsession, and public performance. The result is a book that feels both timeless and current. Its wisdom is old, but its target is modern self-absorption. That combination explains why the book has endured. It addresses a permanent human weakness in a culture that constantly feeds it. When you translate the book into daily practice, several clear lessons emerge. First, stay a student. The moment you become more committed to appearing smart than to becoming wiser, growth starts to slow. Second, separate the work from the identity you want the work to give you. Do the task because it matters, not because it makes you look important. Third, become less reactive to praise and criticism. Neither should define you. Praise can inflate. Criticism can clarify. Use each carefully. Fourth, when you fail, resist the urge to dramatize. Ask what is true. Ask what can be learned. Ask what needs to change. Fifth, remember that purpose is stronger than vanity. When you are anchored in service, craft, or duty, you become less vulnerable to the distortions of ego. These lessons sound simple, but they're difficult because ego is persistent. It always wants to come back. It wants to narrate your life in flattering ways. It wants to protect itself from discomfort. It wants quick validation and soft interpretations. That is why Holiday's book is best understood not as a one-time insight, but as a repeated reminder. Ego must be noticed again and again. It must be interrupted again and again. The work is ongoing. In practical terms, that may mean listening more, speaking less, preparing more, boasting less, apologizing faster, and remembering that what matters most is not whether you feel impressive, but whether you are actually becoming more disciplined, more useful, and more honest. The fight against ego is quiet work, but it changes everything else. What makes ego is the enemy so enduring is that it does not ask us to abandon ambition. It asks us to purify ambition. It asks us to remove the vanity, the self-obsession, the need for constant recognition, and the defensiveness that so often poison meaningful striving. Ryan Holiday's vision is not one of self-erasure. It is one of proportion. See yourself clearly. Respect the work. Accept the discipline of being corrected. Refuse the intoxication of praise. Meet failure without making it your identity. Keep your attention on purpose rather than performance. In a world that often encourages endless self-display, this is a quiet and radical message. You do not need to become bigger in your own mind to do important things. In many cases, you need to become smaller there. You need to stop making everything about your image and return to the work itself. That is where freedom begins. That is where steadiness begins. That is where real progress becomes possible. The enemy, Holiday says, is ego. And the reason it is such a dangerous enemy is that it can sound like confidence, look like ambition, and even masquerade as pain. But once you learn to recognize it, you begin to see a better path. A path of humility without weakness. Confidence without vanity. Ambition without performance. Success without intoxication. Failure without collapse. In the end, the book leaves us with a demanding but hopeful challenge. If we can stop worshiping the self, we may finally become capable of the work, growth, and inner peace that ego has been quietly stealing from us all along.